Welcome to RegTalks, a podcast dedicated to the latest trends in the world of RegTech, FinTech, and financial regulations. My name is Klaus Christensen, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Know Your Customer. Today it's my great pleasure to welcome Nicholas Pratt as my guest. A reporter and editor with more than 20 years of experience, Nicholas Pratt is the operations and technology editor at Funds Europe and an industry expert and keen observer of international trends in the area of fund and asset management, banking technology, and commercial risk. Nick, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
I imagine it's interesting for you to be on the other side of the interview table for once and being asked questions instead of being the one asking them. So to get started, can you tell me a bit more about your journey in the funds and asset management industry? How has this become your area of expertise, and what are some of the biggest changes that you've observed over the years?
I don't know if this is unusual or not, but I guess I've always wanted to be a journalist since about 10 years old. So I think it came from watching a lot of sort of political thrillers in the 80s where the investigative journalists always seemed to be the heroes. And then I studied English literature and philosophy at university, which probably the worst 2 degrees possible for a career in journalism, because you're writing obscure 5,000-word dissertations for an audience of 1, and you save all the best important bits till right at the end, as opposed to writing sort of 300-word news stories for as wide an audience as possible, and where all the information is in either the headline or the first paragraph. But I got through that and moved to London and applied for as many journalism jobs as I could whilst doing some interesting other jobs. And then finally landed a job at a magazine called Banking Technology. So I started there in 1999 and have sort of stayed in that area ever since. After Banking Technology, I took over as editor of Risk Professional magazine, which was kind of financial risk. And that was just as Basel II was sort of in the beginning of being introduced. And I mean, personally, I think Basel II sort of marked the beginning of a new approach to financial regulation rather than a sort of crude one-size-fits-all approach to capital adequacy. There were various grades related to sort of how sophisticated your internal modelling processes. And I guess the idea being that the better organised you were as an institution, the less you pay in capital adequacy or capital requirements. And then in 2003, I was launch editor of a magazine called Enterprise Risk, which looked at physical risk, sort of insurance combined with financial risk and stuff like catastrophe bonds. Also sort of early ESG issues like sustainability ratings, and also business continuity issues. I think we had an article about the pandemic. I think the headline was When SARS Attacks. But unfortunately, it proved too ahead of its time. And it sort of closed just as I moved to Ireland. And so I moved from London to Ireland in 2004 and then started working for Funds Europe then. Gradually over sort of the last 17 years, that tech stuff, which used to be a sort of a small bit at the back of the magazine, has become a bit bigger and worked its way sort of slowly towards either the middle or, on rare occasions, somewhere near the front. And then most recently, we've launched a sort of a dedicated arm called Funds Tech, which is to focus on the new and innovative side of technology rather than just sort of the 1,500-word articles on clearing and settlement. And we run a series of events, or we did at least, webinars, podcasts, all of those kind of things. And in the last couple of weeks, we just launched a dedicated website, which is www.fundstech.com. So you can see all of that sort of content in one place. I guess when you ask, well, what's the biggest change I've seen in those sort of 17 years, it's probably, like I said, my kind of stuff being moved slightly forward sort of in the magazine. So it's becoming a more important part of the business rather than just sort of a niche.
Wow, that is one journey. You have had a front row seat to see how technology changed and how regulation changed and what drives what in this industry.
Yeah, I think I've been a bit lucky to be in the right place at the right time, first things.
If we look at the calendar of recent and upcoming regulations, so much has happened and is happening still in relation to asset management. Which ones do you think are going to have the biggest impact?
I don't know if necessarily I've picked ones that will have the biggest impact, but I've picked sort of three areas that I find the most interesting. The first one is the SFDR, Sustainable Financial Disclosure Regulation. As we all know, sort of ESG and sustainable investing is everywhere. And so is the sort of prospect of greenwashing. And ESFDR and the sort of EU's taxonomy and action plan is I guess, only the first step in a marathon, but you have to start somewhere. You know, it's not perfect, and there are already those that feel it goes too far and those that feel it doesn't go far enough. But I think it's going to be very interesting to see how it progresses. It'll be very interesting. And I guess it also raises that prospect of kind of unintended consequences with regulation. That, you know, does it become too expensive or too difficult to comply, and therefore it's only the large, massive asset managers that can afford to meet the regulatory requirements? Finishing on that, it's also sort of how prescriptive does that regulation become? I guess that the point of the SFDR is to try and create a standardized environment for the definitions that people use for making their ESG disclosures. So at least everyone is using the same measurements, even if they are sort of talking about slightly different things. But as one ESG manager sort of told me, no one wants to be told what good looks like. The second area I picked is around sort of some of the substance regulations, like CP86 in Ireland, and there are various sort of different ones around Europe, which is basically, what will that mean for the future of the delegation model? Like, increasingly, we're seeing the use of third-party management companies, but, how effective are they, or are people sort of just using the sort of regulations to their own advantage? And I guess related to that is the various talk about a more aligned tax system internationally and levelling of corporation tax rates. And that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. How important are tax rates when it comes to choosing a domicile? Because, we often hear a lot about the talent of the people available, the education system, and everything but the tax rate is mentioned. So when that's put to the test, how important will that be? And I guess you add to that the UK and the regulatory impact of Brexit. And then the third area I'd pick would be around digital assets and crypto especially. So we're seeing sort of some countries trying to set themselves up as crypto hubs. And we're also seeing sort of more mainstream or institutional interest in crypto. But in order for that interest to be justified, you have to have more rules around it. So I guess, are we going to see a two-tier system develop where you have the largely unregulated world, which sort of some of the digital natives or more the digital purists want, that kind of environment free of central banks, etc. But anything institutional will need that sort of familiar kind of structure.
Very interesting areas. I think to your last point, an interesting question is how much of that crypto scene will be taken over by, for example, CBDCs, the central bank cryptocurrency. We've seen some efforts there globally, and how will that actually be implemented, and will it take over a significant part of the system there?
Some of these disruptions or innovations, are they genuine innovations, or is it just that they don't have to deal with any regulation? Is social media, Twitter, something that took off because you're instantly publishing without any regulation? As soon as you start to bring some regulation in, do you lose the innovation? And I guess that also raises the question that if regulation is so critical, that there may be something is wrong.
That is an interesting thought, yes. If regulation is so critical, does that point to deeper underlying problems? Very interesting. I also like your point about ESG. We have looked from our company standpoint at ESG measures, and the whole sustainable finance movement and regulations that are coming in and have already been enacted here in Europe. But we found there is still a big challenge in getting those numbers to match from different suppliers, from different approaches. And we certainly would welcome first a bit more clarity in the form of regulations, maybe something a bit weaker that isn't quite up to that standard, but at least that we're talking about the right numbers.
Yeah, no, I think it's a bit of a mess at the moment, but at least there's a recognition that it's a mess.
You've mentioned Basel driving some changes. And my question would be, are regulatory changes even the main driver for large-scale innovation within the industry, or what is?
Prior to the pandemic, I would have said yes, definitely. It probably still is, although I get sometimes uncomfortable with the word innovation, or I'd like to use it with caution, particularly around regulation, because it makes me think of sort of Bernie Madoff or innovative accountancy. I guess the single thing about regulation, it has to be done. And that's, I think, what drives spending on technology. But I guess the thing that always comes up is the nirvana for any sort of regulatory approach is to comply with the regulations, but also make your organization more efficient. So, so you're not doing all of that work for the sake of it, but you're actually using it to know more about how your company operates. It's only really when you try and meet some of these large regulatory requirements that you realize how disorganized your data management is. So I think it's been a massive influence on data management, and data management has been a massive influence on technology itself. So you see these kind of front to back outsourcing offerings purely because people just want one provider where possible doing all of their operations so that they can manage their data rather than using 5-6 different vendors.
Going back to asset management a bit, what areas are asset management firms prioritizing when it comes to technology investments?
Yeah, I mean, we've done several surveys on this in sort of recent months, and the main priority is probably data management. I guess going back to the point I made, data sort of drives everything, regulatory reporting, client reporting, performance reporting, and there's been that sort of growing recognition that data management is poor when you have so many sort of disparate systems. So at the same time, there's also that kind of demand to consolidate vendors and systems. And what this might lead to, I think, is a sort of a different approach to technology provision. And this might be for large and small asset managers, where you have almost like a single operational outsourcing partner who doesn't necessarily provide all of that technology, but kind of curates it. So I think the future seems to be this kind of, and I use the word advisedly, a kind of technology ecosystem where you have lots of sort of microservices, where you're still able to use fintechs and regtechs that are sort of specialists, but they're feeding into an environment that is managed possibly by a third party, where it's all sort of cloud-based, software as a service-based, usage-based, and everything is compatible and talks to each other. The operations guy, the asset manager, is just someone who's sort of managing those vendor relationships and setting the strategy for the asset manager rather than developing lots of Excel spreadsheets.
I absolutely understand that, especially for a lot of the smaller asset management firms, it would be very challenging to find out what all the technology vendors do and what are the pros and cons and work through that again and again. And working with a larger vendor makes that easier. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think if you just think of, if you're an asset manager starting today or launching today, what approach would you take? It would probably be very different from the approach that the large established asset managers have now.
Another question, based on your insights, can you share some interesting regional trends you might have spotted in relation to tech and asset management? Where are some of the most interesting innovations coming from, and what elements do you think are fostering such a favorable environment?
I think there's interesting developments with digital and crypto assets, and countries like Liechtenstein looking to sort of carve out the niche, also Switzerland. But then you have sort of the larger countries in Europe looking to sort of maintain the status quo and ensure that you don't necessarily have this uneven environment where countries can game the system. There are sort of various trends. I've seen things like in France, there's a lot of development on AI, artificial intelligence. A lot of that seems to stem from a kind of tradition of engineering and mathematics in the school system, putting a lot of government money into funding a lot of these startups. And if you try and develop a speciality for a particular technology, then it feeds itself and, it generates more companies looking to do the same. I guess I have a theory related to that about why Ireland is so strong in the RegTech space. Now, I should add, it is completely without any evidence, but it stems basically from a religious tradition and the strong role of the church in the state. And this part of the national psyche, the worst will always happen, this kind of national pessimism. And there's a remarkably high number of people in Ireland that do actuarial sciences for a degree, because it's a solid career choice, and I think it's a trend sort of based on that worst case scenario fears. And there's also this whole industry in after school tuition grinds because there's this paranoia about not doing well enough, not getting enough points. So I think that partially explains why Ireland is so strong on RegTech. There's a whole number of people qualified in that area, and it's the sort of software equivalent of the actuarial sort of science degree. So that's one theory, like I say, completely without evidence.
Good one, but I'm not commenting though because my wife is Irish, obviously. So with that background, I'm careful.
My wife is Irish.
It must be some special combination here because what I've seen in Asia, even that in both Singapore and Hong Kong, especially, that they recognize Ireland as a force in RegTech. Enterprise Ireland is a big driver there, but they could promote anything in the fintech, financial tech events in Asia. They have promoted a pavilion that they called the Ireland RegTech Pavilion for that reason, because we're so strong there. Yeah. Okay, one last question that I ask all my guests. If tomorrow you woke up, Nick is the global financial regulator, what would be the first thing you would do?
I've actually put 4 things down. It's probably a bit greedy, but the first one is probably the most important. First thing I would do is try and address the chasm-like pay gap between regulators and the people they regulate. So it can't help with recruitment either. So I think if you were to radically reshape the respective remuneration of regulators and the people they regulate, we'd get a far more efficient regulatory system and far more people within the regulators. The second thing I would do, and it's not necessarily a regulation, but I would encourage asset managers and banks just to get on with it. And, if you buy into the concept of responsible regulation, then just get on with it. Every single institution is banging on about their social responsibility and divesting from firms that ride roughshod over the rules. But then whenever any regulation is introduced, there's just this endless lobbying process. And then by the time the regulation does come in, it's already time to revise it anyway, because the world has changed. So I would like to see less money spent on lobbying and more money spent on just getting on with it and spending it on technology or systems. Third thing of my single request would be to encourage a more radical regulatory agenda following a crisis. Like in the last 20 years, we've seen, I don't know how many once in 100 years events. And you think this is the perfect opportunity to introduce radical changes whilst it's still fresh in everybody's memory that whatever system we have at the moment clearly doesn't work. But again, maybe it's related to the endless lobbying that it takes so long for changes to actually come in, that it just sort of doesn't seem to happen. And you look at the environment now, and we've got sort of 4 or 5 tech companies bigger than ever before, making more profit. So that whole too big to fail thing doesn't seem to have had any effect. We're in a more inequitable environment than ever before. So that's a disappointment. And then finally, I would ban Elon Musk from holding any kind of company directorship and hold him and anyone to account that abuses their messaging platform. And also, one final one, I would find anyone who misuses the term innovation and talent when it comes to financial services. So, let's not get carried away. Let's just use efficient and competent.
Love the last point, but actually I love all your points. It's, I think, the most comprehensive answer I've ever gotten for this question. Fantastic. This has been an excellent interview. Thanks so much, Nick.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I've really enjoyed answering questions because I don't get to answer many questions.
Thank you for listening to this episode of RegTalks. My name is Klaus Christensen, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of award-winning RegTech provider Know Your Customer. If you liked the episode, please subscribe to the whole series and leave us a review. And if you'd like to connect with us, suggest a guest or a topic for an upcoming episode, please send us a message at info@knowyourcustomer.com or visit knowyourcustomer.com/RegTalks.